"Old man, just mop the floor and stay out of official business." The words, sharp and dismissive, sliced through the tense air of the corridor. Captain Evans, his jaw tight and his uniform impeccably starched, didn't even bother to look at the janitor he was addressing. He was focused on the heavy oak door of the command center, the epicenter of the Academy's most important war games in a decade. The janitor, an elderly man named Silas, simply nodded, his gaze dropping back to the murky water in his bucket. His hands, gnarled by age and work, tightened for a moment on the handle of his mop. He didn't say a word. He just continued his slow, methodical work, a ghost in gray overalls navigating a world of crisp, green uniforms. If you believe every veteran deserves our deepest respect, type honor in the comments below. Silas Croft had been a fixture at the West Point Military Academy for nearly 15 years. To the thousands of cadets and officers who strode these hallowed halls, he was little more than a part of the building itself, a quiet, stooped figure who appeared after hours to erase the day's scuffs and spills, leaving the floors gleaming for a new morning of drills and lectures. He was in his late 70s, with a face like a weathered map and eyes that held a deep, settled calm. He moved with a subtle limp, a slight drag of his left foot that was more pronounced when he was tired. His life was one of quiet routine. He lived in a small, sparse apartment a few miles from the base, his few possessions kept with a soldier's precision. A single, faded photograph on his nightstand showed a much younger man in uniform, surrounded by smiling comrades whose faces were now lost to time. He never spoke of his past, and no one ever thought to ask. Why would they? He was just the janitor, a man who had ended his days scrubbing floors for a living. They saw his worn-out overalls, not the ramrod straightness that would unconsciously take over his spine whenever the bugle sounded taps at the end of the day. They saw his slow, deliberate movements, not the economy of motion that spoke of decades of ingrained discipline. They saw an old man, and they saw nothing more. The disrespect was a constant, low-grade hum in his daily life, but it had grown louder with the arrival of men like Captain Evans. Evans was the epitome of the new breed of officer, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He saw Silas's age and humble station as a personal failing, a life misspent. He would make sharp, cutting remarks as Silas worked, thinly veiled insults about his pace or his purpose. "Still at it, old-timer? Don't you ever get tired of pushing that water around?" Silas never rose to the bait. He would simply offer a quiet, "No, sir," and continue his work, his dignity an invisible shield that the captain's barbs couldn't seem to penetrate. Today, the tension on the base was palpable. It was the final day of Operation Vindicator, a massive, simulated war game designed to test the Academy's command structure under extreme pressure. A red team, composed of elite Special Forces instructors, had simulated a full-scale infiltration of the base. Alarms blared intermittently. Urgent, coded messages echoed from speakers. The Academy was on lockdown, and inside the command center, Captain Evans was losing. The red team was a ghost, a phantom menace that was dismantling his defenses with surgical precision. Every move Evans made was countered. Every strategy he deployed was anticipated. On the massive digital map dominating the front wall, red icons advanced relentlessly, flanking his blue forces, cutting off supply lines, and creating chaos. His superiors, including several high-ranking Pentagon officials, were observing remotely, and Evans could feel his career prospects dimming with every flashing red light. Silas, following his unchangeable route, was tasked with cleaning the corridor outside the command center. The drill didn't change his duties. Floors still needed to be mopped. Through the slightly ajar door, he could hear the frantic, clipped communications. He could see the map, a chaotic dance of icons that made his old heart beat a little faster. He watched for a few minutes, his mop forgotten in his hands. He saw it immediately, the flaw in the captain's strategy. Evans was focused on the frontal assault, desperately trying to plug the gaps the red team was creating. But he was blind to the larger picture. The red team wasn't just attacking. They were hurting him. It was a classic pincer movement, a brilliant flanking maneuver straight out of a playbook Silas knew like the back of his own hand. He saw a young lieutenant rush out of the room, his face pale with stress. Silas stepped forward, his voice quiet. "Son," he began, "tell the captain to check grid sector Kilo 7. They're not just flanking, they're encircling." The lieutenant stared at him, bewildered. Before he could respond, Captain Evans stormed out of the door. "What is this? What are you doing talking to my men?" he snarled, his eyes blazing with frustration. "I told you to stay out of official business." He jabbed a finger at Silas's chest. "Get this janitor out of here. He is a security risk. This is a restricted area." Two military policemen, posted at the door, moved toward Silas, their expressions apologetic but firm. They were just following orders. Just as they reached for his arms, a new figure appeared at the end of the hall. The ambient noise of the corridor seemed to vanish, sucked into a vacuum of pure authority. It was a 4-star general, his chest a constellation of ribbons and medals, his face a granite testament to a lifetime of command. This was General Marcus Thompson, a living legend, the supreme Allied commander of NATO forces, who was on base to observe the final hours of the simulation. The entire corridor snapped to attention. Captain Evans's back went rigid, his face paling as he executed a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. General Thompson's eyes, however, swept past the frantic captain. They scanned the scene, taking in the flustered MPs and the old janitor they were about to escort away. And then they stopped. The general froze, his stern, observational mask dissolved, replaced by a wave of raw, unfiltered shock. His gaze locked onto Silas, and the years seemed to melt away from his face, replaced by a memory so powerful it was almost physically visible. He ignored Captain Evans completely. He ignored the saluting guards. He walked forward, his steps slow and deliberate, until he stood directly in front of the old man in the gray overalls. The entire corridor held its breath. "Sergeant Major?" The general's voice was a low rumble, thick with an emotion no one could place. Silas Croft? My God, is that really you?" For the first time all day, Silas stood up straight. The years seemed to fall away from his shoulders, the stoop of the janitor replaced by the unbending posture of a soldier. The limp was gone. He looked the 4-star general directly in the eye, a flicker of the old fire returning to their depths. "General Thompson, sir," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's been a very long time." The general's eyes welled slightly. He turned, his gaze now falling upon the utterly baffled Captain Evans. The force of that gaze was like a physical blow. "Captain," the general's voice was dangerously quiet, "do you have any idea who you were just ordering out of your command center?" He didn't wait for an answer. "This is Sergeant Major Silas Croft." He was the senior NCO of Special Operations Task Force Omega. The men who served with him called him the Whispering Ghost. Most of his missions are still classified so far above your pay grade that you couldn't get clearance with a congressional order. A collective gasp went through the small crowd in the hallway. General Thompson wasn't finished. He pointed to the tactical map visible through the doorway. "The pincer movement the red team is using to humiliate you right now? The Wraith's Gambit? He invented it. He wrote the doctrine on asymmetrical warfare that these instructors are using to tie you in knots." He then pointed to a thin, white scar just above his own eyebrow. 30 years ago, in a jungle whose name you've only read in history books, a young Lieutenant Thompson and his platoon were caught in a catastrophic ambush. We were outnumbered 10-1. We were dead. But we had Sergeant Major Croft. For 3 days he held them off, saved every single one of us, and led us out of hell. I wear this scar to remember the price of freedom, and to remember the man who paid it for me that day. The silence in the corridor was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of computers. General Thompson turned back to Silas, his expression a mixture of awe and profound respect. He decided to make his point undeniable. In a loud, commanding voice that echoed off the polished floors, he shouted a string of words that meant nothing to anyone else present. "Scythefall, Echo 9 Tango, execute Protocol Dagger Point." The cadets and officers exchanged confused glances. It was gibberish, a code so old it had been decommissioned for decades. But Silas's eyes snapped to the map. His mind, a tactical computer dormant for years, whirred back to life. Without a single moment of hesitation, he replied in a voice that was pure command, a voice that had once sent men into the fire. "Acknowledged, sir." Counter with a serpent's coil, feign a full retreat at Waypoint Delta. Draw their flanking force into the ravine at Grid 9 Victor. Use air support as a hammer against their anvil. We'll have them rolled up and neutralized in 15 minutes. It was brilliant. It was devastatingly effective. It was the one move nobody, not even the elite red team, would see coming. General Thompson stared at him for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. He turned to the ghost-white Captain Evans. "You have your orders, Captain." Execute. Evans, looking as if he'd been struck by lightning, simply stammered, "Yes, yes, sir," and stumbled back into the command center, barking the new orders into his headset. Within minutes, the tide of the entire simulation turned. The red icons on the map faltered, then began to retreat, then collapsed entirely. A cheer erupted from the command center. Operation Vindicator was saved. Back in the corridor, General Thompson did something no one had ever seen him do. He brought his heels together, raised his hand to his brow, and delivered a slow, perfect salute. Not to a fellow officer, but to the janitor. Silas Croft, standing tall in his worn-out overalls, returned it with equal precision. One by one, every soldier in that hallway, from the lowly MPs to the shell-shocked lieutenants, followed their general's lead, their hands raised in a unified gesture of profound respect for the humble man who had just taught them all what a hero truly looked like. Later that day, a deeply humbled Captain Evans found Silas by his janitor's cart. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice choked with shame, I have no words. My behavior was inexcusable. I am so sorry." Silas simply placed a hand on the young captain's shoulder. "Respect is not owed to a uniform, Captain," he said softly. "It is owed to the person wearing it. And sometimes the most important people don't wear a uniform at all. Remember that the story of the janitor who saved the war games became a legend at the Academy." Silas Croft was officially honored in a base-wide ceremony. He politely declined a medal, but he did accept a new position: special advisor and guest lecturer on unconventional warfare tactics. His portrait was hung in the Academy's Hall of Heroes, right next to MacArthur and Patton. The final, lasting image of Silas Croft was not of him in uniform, or even in his janitor's overalls. It was of him standing before a rapt audience of young, eager cadets, the future leaders of the Army. He wore a simple tweed jacket, and in his gnarled hand, he held not a mop, but a laser pointer, tracing a complex strategy across a digital map. In the front row, taking meticulous notes, sat Captain Evans, his expression one of deep, abiding respect. The greatest heroes are often the ones who seek no glory, working in silence long after their battles are over. If you believe in honoring these hidden legends who walk among us, subscribe to our channel for more stories that must be told.